Live from Buenos Aires in Argentina, tonight with Jane Dutton. Argentina's failing economy is hitting the public hard with a devastating impact on their day-to-day living. Is South Africa at risk of a similar fate? An Argentinian economist talks us through some of the solutions. We look at why Venezuelans are escaping the hardships in their country and heading to Brazil. And what impact is the influx of migrants having on South Africa's economy? That's tonight with Jane Dutton.
My name is Vuyo Mvogo, and these are your headlines. President Cyril Ramaphosa is about to address world leaders at the United Nations. We'll take you there live.
We are United Nations. We're united.
A day of violence in Cape Town as communities protest against crime. And Home Affairs Minister Malusi Gigaba changes visa regulations to help boost the economy. To that top story now, President Cyril Ramaphosa will shortly deliver his maiden speech at the United Nations General Assembly debate in New York. The theme for the 73rd session of the debate is making the United Nations relevant to all people, global leadership and shared responsibilities for peaceful, equitable and sustainable society. Now, for more of what we may have to expect from President Ramaphosa, let's go live now to our reporter at the UN, Tula Sizwe Simelane. Good evening, Tula. Well, I guess, having listened or watched Donald Trump speak, what do you reckon he may have set the tone for what a Cyril Ramaphosa or other world leaders, for that matter, may have to say?
In a way, Vuyo, that's exactly what he has done. Perhaps it wasn't something that he set out to do to set the tone of what is to come after he speaks, that is the US president. But that's exactly what has happened, because if you look at his speech and you juxtapose it against everything that President Cyril Ramaphosa has said since arriving New York, and in fact even in the days building up to his trip to the UN General Assembly, they are worlds apart. President Ramaphosa has come here to sort of push forward the message of multilateralism and returning back to the agreed ways of doing things and the institutions of global governance and the accords and compacts that have been reached over the past few decades, saying that those really provide the best solutions towards peace. He's preaching the message of peace, going to the extent of saying that the next decade should be the Mandela decade for peace. And basically it seems that's the direction in which South Africa wants to pull things as it gets into the rotating seat at the UN Security Council. So multilateralism on the one hand, and versus President Trump's America First approach, which was again pushed forward in his speech today. Basically, President Trump saying that the United States will look out for its own interests, and it values sovereignty and independence more than it does globalism, and there's what he says is domination by international systems, and therefore a number of pacts that have been reached have fallen by the wayside in the last 2 years since Donald Trump took office, and it appears actually it will continue to be like that. The latest being President Trump announcing that the US will not be taking part in the global compact on migration, which is expected to be concluded in Marrakesh in December this year. He says the US is absolutely not taking part in that. Migration is an issue that should be handled by the countries themselves and elected representatives. The International Criminal Court can expect no cooperation or support from the United States, because the United States will never surrender its sovereignty to a body like the ICC, who are not elected. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, had a finger wagged at them. President Trump saying that they are again ripping off the world, and he doesn't like it, and no one should like it. They should start bringing down prices of oil, and also stepping up their responsibilities in as far as military protection, I suppose, for the facilities where much of the production takes place. And on it went. The stepping up of sanctions on Venezuela and the government there of President Maduro, and also talking about Iran. He had some harsh words for the Iranian leadership, saying that they are a bloodthirsty cohort dictatorship that is basically milking the Iranian people, the Iranian country dry, embezzling funds and basically causing problems all over the region in the Middle East. And so and on it went. The only person that I could find that had kind words from President Trump, I suppose, was the leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un, who went from being referred to as Rocket Man last year and someone with a death wish to being referred to as someone, as Chairman Kim, who is courageous, who was being, respected for his courage. President Trump saying progress is being made in as far as the denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula is concerned. And I suppose the only other people that got some kind words are the countries that work with the United States, the allies of the United States in the Middle East.
Indeed, Tulas, Donald Trump really making no bones about the fact that, as you have summed it up, America will always act in their own national interest. He categorically rejected the ideology of globalism, saying they, as Americans, they embrace the doctrine of patriotism. Now, throwing forward to what we may have to expect from President Ramaphosa, as much as the theme is a global one, I guess nothing hurts from talking a little bit about oneself or about one's country, especially given some of the challenges that we're facing as a country at the moment, which he was asked about at that briefing last night.
Yeah, absolutely, Vuyo. All communication, in fact, from the government communicators who are here always underscores every time they send us an update on the program and what President Ramaphosa has been up to. They always again refer back to the background to say he will outline the domestic and foreign policies, including outlining issues of land and the land reform program in South Africa, which in their words is meant to ensure that there's stability in as far as South Africa is concerned, and this transformation of the South African economy. That line you find from time to time, whether be it new pictures of President Ramaphosa in a courtesy call with the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, or at the Council on Foreign Relations last night, and even invites to his engagement with international media, which is expected to happen a bit later on today. That line is standard to sort of emphasize that this will not only be a statement about foreign policy, but it will also be about clarifying South Africa's positions. South Africa, you'll remember, of course, Vuyo, had that situation where President Trump tweeted about South Africa's land reform policies and basically slammed it and basically said he has instructed Foreign Secretary of State Mike Pompeo to do a thorough investigation and look into what he believes are the wrong policies being pursued by the Ramaphosa administration. It led to protests by Pretoria in as far as the understanding of the U.S. administration of South Africa's land reform processes, because Pretoria insists that yes, there's talk of land expropriation without compensation and even amending the constitution, but everything will be done according to the country's constitutional tenets, and it will be done to ensure that there's stability. The land question needs to be handled such that it's finalized and there's stability going forward in the country. So in that light, President Ramaphosa is expected to outline what exactly South Africa will be pursuing, and as far as its tenure, its 2-year tenure in the UN Security Council, that rotational seat which we will take up in January 2019, and what South Africa will be prioritizing, and as far as that is concerned, especially on the African continent, in countries such as the Central African Republic and countries such as South Sudan, for example, and Lesotho, and all that has been happening, in Libya, around those countries. But also at the same time, it is expected that he will outline what policies South Africa is pursuing domestically, including, of course, that interaction which has been penciled between the Minister of International Relations, Lindiwe Sisulu, and the U.S. Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo.
Tulasizwe Simelane in New York, of course, ahead of that all-important speech that President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to deliver in another, 15 or so minutes. We'll bring you that speech live. Of course, earlier, Tulas also reflecting on the much talked about speech of Donald Trump, where, of course, he was talking all about himself and his country and their rejection of globalism. We'll bring you Ramaphosa's speech as soon as it gets underway. For now, though, let's go to Buenos Aires, where Jane Dutton is.
A faltering economy with rising interest rates hits people where they feel it the most, in their pocket, and impacts on their day-to-day living. How do you prepare for the unexpected when you don't even know what your currency is going to be tomorrow? To help me discuss this and work out a way forward for Argentina and South Africa is economist Miguel Bogiana. Very good to have you with us. How do Argentinians survive this volatile economy? What do they need to focus on?
Well, I would say we have a huge history, a long history of volatility. So in many senses, people are already trained. But there's no good answer, in the sense that you need to adapt every day, and it's inflation is actually a problem that is a consequence of the volatile economy, of the insecure exchange rate, instability of the exchange rate, and basically from the fact that politicians have for the last, I would say, 70 years done was not convenient to be done, in terms of spending way more than what they collect. So all the difference ends up being supplied by printed money, right? So when you continue printing money because you spend more than what you can collect from taxes, you get the situation of a country like Argentina that continues struggling in terms of things that are no longer a problem in the rest of the world.
And printing money, I mean, that's a big warning signal, isn't it, to locals and foreign investors?
Absolutely. Locals, well, I would say we have like a very fine radar for detecting each time that the government will have problems. So the expectations of inflation are really, really fast, because it's really hard to trick people, you know. When you print money and nobody is aware of that, you can trick them for a while. But if you have already pulled that trick so many times, people are already aware of that. So,
but if that trick fails, why is it a trick that the governments keep going back to?
Well, that's a very good question, but that's part of our latest history of, I would say, 40, 50 years in which we continue having the very same problems. If you read the newspapers today, and if you read the newspapers from 30 years ago, 40 years ago, you will be astonished to realize that we're talking about the exact same problems. We're completely stuck.
Okay, so you say that people suffering the consequences of these policies constantly adapt. How do they adapt? I mean, if you don't know what the currency is going to be worth tomorrow, if you don't know what the inflation rate is going to be, how do you protect yourself?
Well, you don't have many ways of doing that. But I would say, for example, that people who can save money, which are very few in this country, honestly, what they do in terms of investments, for example, they pretend to guard themselves with real estate. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, but they're not planning in making any progress with their savings. They're just trying not to lose money, right? Or sometimes when you have a context of very high inflation, you start buying goods, you start buying stuff, because you know that at least those things, that stuff will be worth something in the future.
And those who can afford it, I mean, is there a capital outflow from the country? Does it, are the UK, US bank accounts increasingly attractive for those who've got money here?
Absolutely, Switzerland as well. So,
and that clearly doesn't help.
The government, the state has predatory practices in terms of the extremely high taxes that we now have. So there's a lot of evasion as well. There's a lot of tax evasion, sometimes because that's the only way for some small companies to survive, right?
But what went wrong? 3 years ago, the IMF loans have been paid off. Inflation, unemployment was 6%. It's now 9%. Macri promised zero poverty. Now he's gone to the IMF with his begging bowl. What happened?
Well, to be honest, I would say the last government, it was 12 years in power. And all the numbers that you were seeing in terms of employment were true, but at the same time were the consequence of the government hiring everybody that was not able to get a job and to put it to work for the government. So if you take a look at the size of the government as a proportion of GDP, when Nestor Kirchner started his government in 2003, government spending over GDP was 24%. When Christina Kirchner left, government spending over GDP was 44%. So they actually doubled the size of the government.
But people had jobs.
Well, it's not that people have jobs, it's that you have to continue taxing everybody else for them to keep them in the government. But so the private sector got completely, had such a burden of these high taxes that now it's really hard for the private sector to generate employment of quality and that actually has a use in the economy. So there's a lot of people working for the state that actually don't produce anything. And that is a huge problem. I would say that's probably a good summary of what was going on in the last 15 years. Instead of tackling the problems in the right way, generating growth, well, you just sweep them below the carpet.
Okay, can I read a tweet to you? You say, I wish a worse crisis than 2001 so Argentina can reduce the state, taxes and unions. I mean, sort of paraphrasing you here, you sort of said, whatever cost.
Well,
isn't that a bit radical? I mean, why would you?
It is. What I was meaning, and obviously that was a time when Twitter was even 140 characters to express an idea. It's obvious that I don't want any crisis or bad time for no one, but our history tells us that you only do what you have to do when there's no other alternative. And that was the spirit of that tweet, right? To finally get to a point in which politicians will have to do the right thing just because there's no alternative.
But that's what it seems to be happening, what you are advocating there, the reduction of the state, the targeting of unions. I mean, is that the way forward? And
It doesn't
Where does it leave Argentinians and their rights?
It doesn't look like so much at this point, I would say. But, for example, now that the government has to go to the IMF, well, they end up finally trying to get to fight fiscal deficit. But that's just something that needs to be done. But if you don't have the proper reforms, there's no way the country will be able to grow again.
So, I mean, what lessons do you learn from this? And, for example, what could South Africa, who's also facing its own, economic nightmare, fiscal cliff, what can South Africa learn from the mistakes made by Argentina in order not to do the same?
It's really hard to learn from a country who's making the mistakes over and over again.
But surely it should be telling you what not to do. I mean, can you walk away and say, right, we should stop?
Well, I would say
raising inflation.
I would say that
pushing up taxes.
It's a global trend. It has been a global trend for the last 20 years, probably, to have the size of a state to grow. But now, for example, here in Argentina, everybody likes to talk about Scandinavian countries, and they claim they have a big state, they have high taxes, and still they have a high quality of life. But if you take a look at them, they're now taking taxes down, and that's what's also happening in many countries of Europe that have been stagnating for the last 10, 15 years. And the problem is that sometimes you make comparisons that are not valid, because even those countries that have European and Scandinavian countries that have high taxes and good quality of life have way more economic freedom than countries like Argentina. So if you take a look at the size of the trade as a percentage of GDP, Argentina, it's not an open economy. And that's not the same claim that you can do from Scandinavia or Europe. Those are very open economies. But still, with their openness, they have realized that they have to reduce taxes. And there's a global competition in terms of taxes. The US, it's become a great participant in that competition, with Trump reducing taxes at such an aggressive pace. So I think most countries of the world will now be facing the pressure of some other countries taking taxes down, and that's a competition towards trying to, seduce investments globally.
Okay, might tariffs, the tariff war that's happening, the trade war that's happening, might that benefit emerging economies in a sense that they could fill gaps?
It's hard to tell, I think, so far.
For example, I mean, your agriculture market and your soy market, for example, you'd be...
Well, we have, for example...
climbing in there.
It's a good question that you're posing, because, for example, we have restrictions to enter a market like the US or Europe in terms of our agricultural products. So, in many ways, globalization, it's a good idea, but then what Trump is doing, and to some extent China, it's in Europe, probably I would say the world, it's maybe going back on its own paces in terms of saying, okay, we thought we liked globalization, but now that imposes a high cost in some countries. For example, in the US, what Trump has been proposing has to do with many anti-globalization ideas. Why? Well, if you remember, Make America Great Again pretends to bring jobs back to the US that were taken abroad for reasons as it was cheaper to make them abroad. So now it's becoming, and this tariff war, in the end, it's like a war against globalization.
Okay, and then the message for South Africa is not to look in this direction, but to look somewhere else if they want to pull themselves out of the doldrums.
Probably, I would say the message is if you really want to help people, you need to have the health of the private sector, who's the sector who can actually produce quality jobs and provide growth to the country, well, as free as possible to do things. Because otherwise you have the government or the state, depending on how you want to look at it, but competing for the resources, because taxes is like extracting resources from the private sector into like a redistribution of some own decision from the government, and that almost always makes harder for any country to grow.
And that's it from me, Jane Dutton in Buenos Aires. Time now to hand you back to my colleague, Vuyo Mvoko in Johannesburg.
Jane Dutton in Buenos Aires. Well, just a reminder, we'll bring you the President's speech at the United Nations live as soon as it starts. When we return, we'll have the day's news. Stay with us. Angry Cape Town residents say they've had enough of gangsters terrorizing their communities. Residents from over 10 Cape Flats communities embarked on a shutdown this morning to raise awareness about the issues affecting them. Police fired stun grenades, rubber bullets, tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowds blocking major roads. eNCA's Ati Mtongana was there.
Bonteheuwel, one of the hot spots in the Cape Flats where the shutdown took place on Tuesday morning.
I was on my way to Cancer Medical Center. There was no transport. I had to walk. And when I came here, just here to turn the bend here to go to Cancer Medical Center. So they was shooting tear gas. It was terrible.
Residents are fighting for an end to gangsterism, high unemployment, poverty and crime.
Our communities are being held hostage by gangsters, by crime. Every time of the day or night, we hear bullets. Our children are being mowed down, be they innocent civilians, be they part of gangsters, and we feel that we've just had enough. And communities across the Western Cape, be it rural, urban or peri-urban, they need leadership. They are yearning for leadership to say that we've had enough, what must we do?
Kensington is another area that was shut down.
It's surprising to us to see this amount of police presence. We never see it in our area. Although there's bullets going off daily in Kensington and Factorton on our people.
The Human Rights Commission says this could have been avoided had government listened to the people.
People have got the right to protest. They don't have a right to irresponsibility and also the right to be protest in peacefully. But what we have observed, obviously, all this that you mentioned about the action of the police must be referred to IPIT for investigation. If community leaders and if government listen to people and come out to people and talk to people and engage people, people don't need to go to the street.
Several people have been arrested here in Bonteheuwel, including some community leaders. Police will continue to maintain law and order at Tongana, Cape Town.
South African tourism is unlikely to be bolstered by Home Affairs Amendment travel policies. Well, that's according to the Tourism Business Council of South Africa, which is not impressed with the announced changes. Government says people traveling to South Africa with minors will no longer be required to carry documentation proving parental consent. eNCA's Dimagazo Tugwana has that story.
Changes to South Africa's visa regime are expected to improve economic activity locally as part of government's stimulus plan. But what do these changes entail exactly?
Rather than requiring all traveling minors who are foreign nationals to carry documentation proving parental consent and certificates of birth, we will rather strongly recommend that the parents of these minors carry this documentation.
The tourism sector contributes about 2.9% to GDP and employs just under 700,000 people. Gigaba says travelers without the required documentation won't be turned away, but will be given the opportunity to prove parental consent. A new passport for children is also in the pipeline. It'll detail the parents' information, ending the requirement to carry birth certificates when traveling with minors. But some say the minister's stance is as clear as mud.
If you say to an international traveler that we strongly advise that you carry this type of documents, you are simply saying that they should carry those types of documents. We need to have a clear policy position in terms of whether we want it or we don't want it.
Home Affairs under the very same minister effected the controversial policy in 2014. Under the regulations, foreign nationals and South Africans traveling with children had to present the minors' unabridged birth certificates. They also had to provide parental consent for the children. This regulation was meant to curb child trafficking, but it backfired, with tourism as the biggest casualty. It's estimated that the tourism industry lost about 7.5 billion rand as a result of the controversial regime. With hundreds of thousands of tourists turned away, the country's attractiveness dropped 15 positions on the Henley Passport Index from 35. 4 years later, the minister has made an about turn, at least with regards to travellers into the country. But he will not concede that perhaps the regulations may have been prohibitory and hasty and have negatively affected South Africa's attractiveness as a tourism destination.
This economy is in trouble. And if we recognize tourism as one of those key sectors that will stimulate growth, we need to take bold moves.
Under the new regime, frequent travellers to the country will get a 3-year multiple visa entry, while those travelling for business and academics will qualify for a 10-year multiple visa. Foreign students who graduate at South Africa's universities with critical skills will be given an opportunity to apply for citizenship. Dimakadzo Tugwana, Pretoria.
Winnie Mandela has received a posthumous Freedom of the City of Johannesburg award. It's the city's highest honor, and it was conferred a day before her birthday. Matikizela Mandela passed away earlier this year at the age of 81. eNCA's Silindelo Masigane was there.
The Freedom of the City of Johannesburg recognizes and rewards the most outstanding service delivery from an individual or group. Winnie Mandela dedicated her life to the liberation of oppressed people in South Africa. But even after the dawn of democracy, she never abandoned her community in Soweto, living there till the very end.
Despite these threats, she remained defiant and continued to speak truth to power. But Winnie's many sacrifices and contributions have been reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the pages of the history of men. We see this in the manner in which she was often referred, largely as Nelson Mandela's wife, nothing more.
Others believe more needs to be done to solidify her contribution.
We can't honor Umama Winnie Mandela while the city of Johannesburg still has colonial and apartheid statues and symbols. It's a direct contradiction to her beliefs and what she fiercely fought for in her life. The plaque statue must fall from the city so that her soul can rest in revolutionary peace. The continuous singing of this stem in the national anthem is also a clear indication that we have a cosmetic reconciliation as a nation.
Matikizela Mandela's daughters received the accolade on her behalf, which is accompanied by a valuable gold medal. Her grandson has called on today's young leaders to put their political differences aside.
I would like to share this message with someone whom I can refer to as a brother, Mr. Julius Malema. And although we do not know each other personally, Mr. Musi Maimane, the both of you have the potential to be the greatest young leadership the African continent has seen. I implore you to reflect on this. Allow your leadership to remain true to the struggle of freedom and true to the struggle of the African child.
On the eve of her birthday, Mama Winnie has, through this award, been immortalized once again in South African history books. But calls have also been made to honor her legacy by embodying the values she lived by. Slinda Lomasigan, Johannesburg.
Well, still ahead, President Cyril Ramaphosa will be speaking live at the United Nations General Assembly. We'll take you there as soon as he speaks. Don't worry. Now, President Cyril Ramaphosa will soon be giving a speech at the United Nations. It will be his maiden speech, and we're going to take you live there as soon as that speech begins. But what do we expect, or what can we expect to come out of his address, and how might global leaders interpret whatever it is that he is going to say? Well, with me tonight is Owen Nkomo from Inkunzi Wealth Group, as well as Unisa politics professor Dirk Kotze. Thank you very much to both of you gentlemen for coming through. Well, I don't know if Donald Trump's comments were or are going to set the tone for what the rest of the leaders are going to say, but there's a lot that he said, which we're going to get to in a short while, time permitting, of course. But from what you said, Prof, what should be foremost in Cyril Ramaphosa's mind?
Well, obviously, as you say, it's his first appearance at the United Nations. He's accompanied by a team of 10 ministers. They've met already quite a number of business leaders in the US. He spoke at the Council on Foreign Affairs as well as Bloomberg. So there's a very strong economic focus in terms of his approach. And I think he wants to present South Africa. In about a month's time, there's going to be the investment conference. And I think he wants to set a scene at the international level about also his stimulus package that he announced recently, and to present South Africa, though officially in a recession, to be seen as a prospect, as a destination for the international financiers and for investments. At the same time, there's expectation that he will deal with the land issue also. And then he wants to set out apparently also the South African foreign policy. Because for many more in the West and the US, the South African foreign policy is not exactly what they want. There was just recently the meeting with China and FOCAC summit also. The fact that South Africa has contact with Iran, for example, is another factor that's, from a US point of view, is not very popular at all. So I think he wants to explain that. Where does South Africa stand, and what is going to be his foreign policy compared to that of former President Zuma, for example?
Okay, Owen Nkomo?
Yeah, and it's a tall order that he has. You're going to the US when South Africa has just recently gone into a technical recession, and you've got a big task at hand. You know, you're talking about GDP not being so great. You're talking about unemployment being terrible, and all the indicators are definitely going against South Africa, and the emerging market story not being a great one at this stage. If you look at Argentina, Venezuela, and a few other emerging markets there. So he's got a very tough task of convincing everyone who's at the conference that South Africa is still the go-to place for emerging markets, because definitely there are differences between South Africa and the other emerging markets. And I think he's got to sell a good story in terms of how he plans to turn the country around economically and convince people to still believe in South Africa and come and invest money here at home. I think he'll be asked a lot of questions around the land question, like the Prophet just said, and he'll be asked a lot about his presentation on Friday on the turnaround strategy, where he levied a few points to us as South Africa and the international community, questions that say, how are you going to implement this? And we see some ratings agencies already starting to question whether this is going to be an effective stimulus package into the economy. But I do hope that he succeeds and gets us the much needed investments into the country.
Well, let's start where exactly where you've just ended. I mean, we had Fitch, the ratings agency, today saying they don't believe the stimulus plan will deliver what it's supposed to.
Yeah, look, it's a difficult one, and I think that the challenge with the country is that we always try something new every time, and we never report on the previous strategy. I think the president has done his best, given a very difficult environment. But what remains to be seen, in my views, how he plans to turn this plan into action, and whether or not he's got enough support to make the plan work.
Although the Fitch people are saying these plans are not new and they relate to long-standing policies. So on that basis alone...
Exactly. I mean, it's easy to quickly judge President Ramaphosa on this, but I think that on a few points that might have held previous presidents, let me just say the previous presidency, honestly, in terms of implementing things. I think Cyril Ramaphosa, as president of the country, has managed to at least deal with some of the issues that could allow him to implement this plan, as long as he gets people that will deliver for him. We know he's got a few task teams that will advise him on agriculture, and we know he's got that group of people he appointed to help him raise $100 billion. All of those people are seasoned economists and business people, and I believe that if it does stick to the plan, potentially the plan could work. But, the issue about South Africa and our policies is failure to firstly implement and secondly to monitor.
Which brings me to my next question, Prof. Today, on the same day, Fitch was expressing their skepticism about what President Ramaphosa announced on Friday. You had the Minister of Home Affairs trying to elaborate on one aspect of that stimulus package, unlocking tourism's potential. But after listening to what he had to say, a lot of people are like, we don't think this is going far enough. Again, sort of strengthening, if you like, Fitch's position. So already, today only, you've had two aspects, of that stimulus package not being well received.
Yes, I guess there's merit in that, but I think the reason why I did that, because it's very close to this medium-term budget policy speech, and some would say, why did it ahead of that speech, which is supposed to deal with many of these issues? I think the immediate explanation, most possibly, is that he wanted to have a very immediate response to the announcement of the recession, because I think the international markets, the international community, wants to see that South Africa has, or the leadership has, some idea of what they want to do. That it's not that the announcement was made and then, like in the past, there's no real response to that. And I think that is the idea of confidence building. It's not because what he announced is to a large extent longer term plans. It is about infrastructural development. It is about the implementation of the visa regime, that can be more short term. About the reprioritizing of the budget. So these aspects are not necessarily easy to produce immediate results. But I think it's more about the symbolism that he says, well, I'm not lost for ideas. I can respond to the current situation in South Africa. If it is possible to turn it around, for example, that it is a very short-term recession, that the next quarter there's a positive growth again, that's like in the past also, then it will, in the end, from my point of view as a political scientist and not an economist, I think it will have a positive message. The big issue, obviously, is next year's election. It creates a lot of uncertainty for the near future. May is talking about May now as the election time. And I think only after the election there will be certainty about what is the position of the ANC in terms of its status in government. Do they need to be involved in a coalition? Do they need the EFF as a partner? All those type of questions I think will then be answered. And that will put him in a better position in order to really sort of lay down a framework of government in which he can take forward. And in the international community, I think, will be also in a better position. I think one remark one has to make is that we as South Africans are generally more pessimistic about ourselves than the international community. We've seen it with these competitiveness reports of the World Economic Forum. So I think to some extent we are underplaying the steps that are taken more than what the international.
But is that not because South Africans want and expect better Yes. Not because they are just, we're beating ourselves down, but simply because everyone is aware, or reckons at least, that we have much greater potential than we are actually doing now. So the push to do better is always there, constantly and consistently.
Yes, I'm not critical about that position of us as the South African population or society, because we set our bar higher than maybe what others expect of us, and that will be good for us. But what I'm saying is sometimes we are hard on ourselves compared to others, and there is therefore in some instances a more positive sentiment than what we recognize. But the fact that we define it as a driving force, as setting standards for ourselves, I don't think anyone can find fault of that.
Now, there's the global situation which affects us whether or not we like it, and often we are affected more by world events than other people who are in a much better economic footing economically. Let's take, for instance, something you mentioned in your opening remarks, what's happening in Argentina and Brazil and so on. Now, we've been at the receiving end of that. Economists tell us, because this has been what is happening in places like Argentina is seen to be something that is most likely, or it's only a matter of time before it happens to countries like ours. What do we do, Owen, to cushion ourselves? And incidentally, this is the theme we're exploring here at eNCA this week.
Yeah, look, it's a bit tricky, but I think that if we stick to the this current momentum that President Ramaphosa has created with the rest of the world investors, where we are convincing the world that we are a good place to come and invest. We have problems, we admit those problems, we are trying to find solutions to them. We are addressing the land issue, we have taken it back to the drawing board, we're reconsidering and probably reconfiguring it. We won't do it haphazardly because we're concerned about the economy and the impact it could have on this GDP. As you know, that most of the GDP negative impact has come from agriculture. I think it's important for the world to see that every policy decision that is being made, our government is committing itself to thinking about it before they implement anything. If you're looking at other policies like the mining sector charter, for example, as part of the broader policy of government, it's been, we've taken a different dimension to where we were in the previous presidency. And I think, that should start giving people confidence that if we do look at the whole country's policies holistically, we could take the country to a different direction relative to where we are right now. And yes, some of the fixes announced by the president, on Friday are long-term in nature. We need to see those getting sent into the economy. You need to see the second round effects of, this 400 billion rand 3-year rollout plan for infrastructure and how it's going to help us out. If you think about, countries like Venezuela, where inflation is in the thousands. When you talk about Turkey, where interest rates are extremely high. If you talk about Argentina, where interest rates are at 60%. South Africa is nowhere near that. We might have issues with our national debt to GDP, which is sitting at 53%.
Which is what, the economists who were sitting where you're sitting yesterday were talking about, that perhaps we're putting a great deal of pressure on a president to deliver something that is simply impossible to deliver now or even during his tenure, because some of the problems for which we are paying now, don't owe their existence to either his tenure or even his predecessors. Yes, his predecessors, his predecessor may have made things worse, but our problem started right at the beginning. I had Azar Jamin yesterday saying we never invested in education, and we are now paying the price. We had another professor, I think Rousseau, who was saying in a number of ways we just didn't do the basics that we ought to have done. You had Zwelinzima Vavi saying we basically surrendered our sovereignty because we thought we were these good, well-meaning people, and the world was going to embrace us as such. But that didn't happen.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting one for you. Because if you go back to the end of apartheid, I think that what happened is that I've always said this in my circles where I discuss with guys, that I always say that just because someone brought in the end to apartheid does not necessarily make them a good governor. It doesn't mean that they can govern a country well. I think there's certainly some things that could have been given to other people to look after, which would have put the country in a different pedestal. Yes, there were problems with apartheid, but I do think that we didn't have to dig as deep as the rest of our continental compatriots had to in terms of infrastructure after the end of apartheid. In some countries, there was no infrastructure, roads were destroyed, medical facilities were damaged because of war, etc. But I think that we potentially could have taken a different dimension if the management of the country was in different hands. And I always say once again that I think that we're dealing with a government that potentially does not understand the industries that it is trying to change. Where you're saying there's real estate. How does the government make meaningful real estate change, or rather change in the real estate space, so that there's a distribution of capital that is fair, that's going to make sure that black and white people get the same chance to sit at the same table and make decisions around changing the country in that sector. The issue of agriculture, the issue of land, Vuyo, it's been debated forever, but I am yet to see a very concrete plan that says we can deal with the issue of land properly and kind of start convincing people that everything that we touch has been well thought out. So I think, therefore, the basics that are being spoken about there, to a large extent, we potentially need to revisit them.
But isn't that what is the problem, Prof? That for the longest time, we had these leaders whom we respected, we put a great deal of trust on because of their track record. Most of them came from a tradition that stood for all good things of this world. But lo and behold, look at the people who have been so disappointing over the past few years, especially. They come from that tradition. Yeah. Isn't it time we say, no matter how well-meaning these people may be, whatever their record politically or in struggle terms has been, maybe we should change things now and be the ones who say, this is how we want our country to move from this point onwards, and whoever then takes charge is the person who's actually going to do what we as a nation want, not them doing for us or on our behalf what they think we want.
Well, ideally speaking, I would support what you are saying. I mean, that is the ideal sort of scenario that one sketches. The point is we are, in a sense, caught also amongst the different political formations in our society. The political parties were, as I said, close to an election, which dictates, in a sense, the dynamics of the time at the moment. I think if we look back to the past, since 1994, even from 1990 onwards, the first priority, as if we look now back, was that of the political dimensions, the political and the constitutional, the idea of political liberation. To a large extent, the social aspects about education, about the economic land, all of those, in a sense, was said, well, we leave it to policy. The fundamentals were not approached. So it is about more periodic policies that really determine that. And I think that is, if we look back now, maybe the mistake that we've made. But I think what we've also allowed to happen is that the majority of our population, 30 million or more, are actually not part of the economy. There's a huge potential for the South African economy which we don't exploit at the moment. It's a dormant market, if you want to use the market concept, which could have completely transformed the South African economy. But because they are not directly involved in the economy, they are actually sort of spectators. They are on the sideline of the South African economy. Therefore, whether it is about black economic empowerment in a more ideal form, whether it's about land reform, from a purely an economic or a market logic point of view, it does make sense in order to broaden the South African economy, and which will be to the benefit or the advantage of everyone, black and white and everyone else, really. And I think that is because there was so much competition of where do you stand politically, on the political spectrum, ideologically speaking, that I think that prevented the innovative thinking in terms of our economy, because you were kept, in a sense, if I can use the word captured, by your own ideology. And it creates certain parameters outside which political leaders could not move. And I think for me, that inhibited, in the end, the potential for innovative thinking beyond the strictly party political domain that were defined by the different political parties.
Okay, if you've just joined us, well, President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to deliver his maiden speech at the United Nations General Assembly. It was scheduled to start, officially at least, about half an hour ago or so. We are waiting for that to happen any minute from now. The theme for this session of the debate is making the United Nations relevant to all people, global leadership and shared responsibilities for peaceful, equitable and sustainable society. So we are going to take you to New York as soon as that happens. More news when we return. Stay with us. Welcome back. My name is Vuyo Mvoko, and these are your headlines at this hour. Angry Cape Town residents say they have had enough of gangsters terrorizing their communities.
Community leaders and if government...
Residents from all over the Cape Flats communities shut down the area this morning. They say this was done to raise awareness about their issues. Police used stun grenades, rubber bullets, tear gas and water cannons to disperse the crowds blocking major roads. Several people have been arrested. A man in his 20s has appeared at the Pretoria Regional Court in connection with the rape of a 7-year-old girl. He's facing further charges of intimidation, possession of drugs, and assault with intent to do grievous bodily harm. It's alleged the incident occurred in the men's bathroom of Dross Restaurant in Silverton, Pretoria. A social media post cited by a newspaper indicated he had been scouting his victim in the children's area. Another paper reports that male patrons assaulted the man when they discovered him raping the child. Police are investigating.
The National Prosecuting Authority will be working closely with our partners like social development and the police to ensure that this girl receives the necessary assistance in order to help her to cope with this horrendous crime that the state alleges that it happened to her. This is because the girl will become one of the key witnesses in the state case against the accused. So we will do everything in our power to assist her. We know that...
Well, the moment we've been waiting for, let's take you live now to the United Nations General Assembly debate in New York, and that's where President Cyril Ramaphosa is about to deliver his maiden speech.
President Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela stood at this podium to declare that, I quote, millions across our globe who stand expectant at the gates of hope look to this organization, the United Nations, to bring them peace, to bring them life, to bring them a life worth living. As we mark the centenary of the birth of this great global leader, Nelson Mandela, we are bound to ask whether the United Nations has met the needs and expectations of the millions who stand at the gates of hope. We are bound to ask what contribution the United Nations has made to a more peaceful, more prosperous, and more equal world. More importantly, we are called upon to ask, as we did yesterday during the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit, which was held here, what the United Nations and the assembled global leadership must do to secure lasting peace, reconciliation, and stability across the globe. Allow me to express the deep gratitude of the government and the people of South Africa to the international community for convening the Peace Summit to honor the memory of Nelson Mandela, as well as to advance his legacy. We applaud the political declaration of the summit, which recognizes the period from 2019 to 2028 as the Nelson Mandela Decade of Peace. This reflects a new and sincere commitment by the world leaders to comprehensively advance peace and security and resolve all conflicts and wars. To succeed in giving effect to this commitment, the UN must become what billions of people across the world want it to be: a representative and a truly democratic global parliament of the people of the world. Throughout its 7 decades, the UN has been a force of hope for the oppressed, exploited, and poor people around the world. During the dark days of colonialism and apartheid, we drew strength, inspiration, and encouragement from the UN and its charter in our quest for freedom and self-determination. With the support of the UN, we as South Africans were able 24 years ago to bring an end to the nightmare of apartheid. Nelson Mandela led us to freedom and gave us the great opportunity to transform our country. We have now embarked on a journey of transformation, and we are making progress to deal with the ugly legacy of the past system of apartheid. Madiba's vision continues to guide us as we seek to improve the lives of our people in many respects, amongst others through improving the educational outcomes of our youth and transforming our economy that was constituted to serve the interests of a few. We have started a comprehensive dialogue on the question of land reform in our country, which is guided by our Constitution and the rule of law, as we seek ways to ensure that the land is shared amongst all who work it, as set out in our Freedom Charter. Even as our country is going through difficult economic challenges, we have made progress. We are reforming our economy and creating an environment that is conducive to investment, and have embarked on an investment drive to attract $100 billion in the next 5 years. To the poor, vulnerable, and marginalized, the UN today is a beacon of promise in a landscape of doubt. To billions across the world, the UN is the most powerful instrument we possess to achieve a more equal, more humane, as well as a more inclusive world. There are men and women with dreams and aspirations that transcend the hardships of the present, who want to contribute to a new global civilization defined by care, justice, and solidarity. They want an end to the greed, ignorance, and conceit that is driving the destruction of our only home, the earth. It is within our hands, as the leaders assembled here today, to forge a more representative, equal, and fair United Nations that is empowered and equipped to lead the struggle to end poverty, unemployment, and inequality in the world. We are a young world where more than half the global population is under the age of 30 years. This is even more pronounced on our continent, Africa, where 2/3 of its people were not yet born when Nelson Mandela was released from 27 years of prison. We are living in the age of youth. This places a responsibility on us as leaders not only to put the interests of young people at the center of our efforts, but also to empower women and young people to be more prominent in directing the course of global affairs. It is young people who are fighting the wars that we started. It is women who are bearing the brunt and hardships of the wars that continue to destroy their lives and their families. As we speak, young lives are being lost and futures are being destroyed. There is an urgency to the measures we must take to end conflict and war. Not only must we stop the death, destruction, and human suffering that is visited daily on millions of people, but we must act with purpose to prevent the loss of another entire generation to its aftermath. We must accept our shared responsibility and our shared interest in ending conflict and using the outcomes of the Nelson Mandela Peace Summit to empower the United Nations to be a more effective instrument for mediation, peacekeeping, and post-conflict reconstruction. Our resolve to end ongoing conflicts and our determination to root out terrorism must be matched by action and by the appropriate deployment of resources. We must act with the same urgency to resolve some of the world's most protracted and intractable disputes. The fact that the people of Palestine have endured occupation and suffering for nearly as long as the United Nations has existed makes their plight no less pressing, nor their suffering any less acceptable. We must similarly intensify our efforts to secure the right of the people of Western Sahara to self-determination and full national sovereignty. One of the greatest challenges to the achievement of global prosperity and development is the continued exclusion of millions of women and young people from meaningful economic participation. It is therefore vital that we deploy every means at our disposal to address youth unemployment and ensure universal access to educational opportunities that are appropriate to the changing world of work. We need a deliberate program to ensure that the digital revolution, which carries such great potential for both disruption and empowerment, is effectively harnessed to promote social justice as well as human progress. The call to leave no one behind requires that we strengthen the institutions of global governance and make them more responsive to the needs of young people, particularly in the developing world. Institutions like the United Nations, the World Bank, IMF, and the WTO need to be reshaped and enhanced so that they may more effectively meet the challenges of the contemporary world and better serve the interests of the poor and marginalized around the world. Reform of the United Nations, and particularly its Security Council, is a priority if we are to give full meaning and effect to the values and the principles enshrined in the United Nations Charter. We must resist any and all efforts to undermine the multilateral approach to international trade, which is essential to the promotion of stability and predictability to the global economy. The history of the global economy informs us that no country can prosper at the expense of all others, and that no people can hope to live in comfort as well as in security for as long as millions of others languish in poverty. It is therefore essential that we take collective responsibility for the development of all nations and for the improvement of the lives of all people. This responsibility is manifest in the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on the Financing of Development, amongst others. Together, they represent our common commitment to tackle poverty, underdevelopment, and environmental degradation. They represent our common commitment to tackle diseases like HIV/AIDS, tuberculosis, malaria, diabetes, and cancer. Our task as global leaders is to pursue the policies that are required to turn intent into implementation and mobilize the resources needed to turn implementation into impact. Your Excellencies, as Africans, we have made significant strides in addressing the challenges that have confronted our continent over many decades. We continue to vigorously implement our commitments contained in the African Union Agenda 2063, which is our collective plan as Africans to rid our continent of underdevelopment, poverty, and conflict, and to improve democratic governance, the rule of law, and the promotion of human rights. We have reached agreement recently on the establishment of an African continental free trade area, which will fundamentally transform African economies, giving rise to a new industrial age on the continent. We are working to silence the guns in Africa by 2020, to bring an end to conflicts that have cost the lives of millions of our people, displaced more, and stunted economic growth and human development. As the continent with the youngest population in the world, Africa has the potential to be the next great frontier for global growth and development. With effective investment in education, improved healthcare, good governance, and greater economic integration, Africa has the potential to develop its productive capacity on a scale and at a rate that will lift tens of millions out of poverty. The youth of Africa are poised to transform their continent. As the people of South Africa, we are committed to be part of this transformation. From the ashes of a system that was described by the UN General Assembly as a crime against humanity, we are building a new democratic nation, united in its diversity. We are working to correct the injustices of our past and to build a society that is free, inclusive, and sustainable. We are pursuing an economic path that draws on the resources and capabilities of all our people to eradicate poverty, unemployment, and inequality. We are determined through our international relations to be a force for progress, for good, for peace, and global equality, and will continue to advance the interests of the African continent and the global South. Allow me to conclude by once more drawing on the wisdom of Nelson Mandela when he said, open quotes, "Sometimes it falls on a generation to be great," close quotes. This is not the generation that will stand expectant at the gates of hope. This is the generation that will change the world. It is the generation of young people that wants to see change. This is their time and this is their age. Let their greatness blossom. I thank you.
President Cyril Ramaphosa in New York delivering his maiden United Nations General Assembly speech. Well, let's go back to my panel now in the remaining minutes we have, gentlemen. Let me start with you, Prof. Your takeaways?
Well, it's a wide-ranging speech, this. He started with what happened yesterday with President Mandela, the statue, and then the peace conference or peace summit that they have had there. It linked in it to the whole notion of the United Nations responsibility, and the theme of this session about the global leadership and responsibilities of the United Nations, specifically with respect to peace building and the ending of wars. Then it went over to South Africa and the South African situation. He referred to some aspects of the domestic policies. It referred to land specifically, to the economic development and the current economic situation. Also, the problems that he said that these government have to address, the economic situation. He focused very much on the youth and the responsibilities of the world in general, including the United Nations, towards the youth and women. He emphasized that very much. I think what he also then came back to look at also the changes or the reform agenda that should be implemented in terms of for global governance in general. He referred to the World Bank and the IMF, and then to UN institutions like the Security Council specifically. So in that sense, there's a continuity in terms of the South African government's policy with respect to, especially to the UN. Then he referred to the addressing of specific disputes and referred specifically to the Palestinian situation and to Western Sahara. Incidentally, the fact that South Africa accepted the Moroccan diplomat or ambassador back to some extent complicate this point that he made. Then he also looked at Africa in general. He almost spoke on behalf of Africa. You know, he referred to the Agenda 2063 of the African Union. He spoke about the free trade agreement or area that was concluded not long ago, and then about the global South. So in that sense, it's a wide-ranging speech, and I think it was for him as his first speech at the United Nations. He presented himself as one of the statesmen of the world, and not just the parochial issues of South Africa.
Owen?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think this was not I'm the president of South Africa type of speech. I think it was I'm a global leader type of speech. He spent a little bit of time talking about South Africa, our economic challenges, our history, the changes we're trying to implement in terms of transformation in the country, to bring equality, to bring opportunities for employment to the youth, to women. And then he spoke obviously about Africa, like the professor has touched on a few of those points that he mentioned. But I think the peculiar point where I think he was jabbing President Trump is where he talks about, the fact that there's no one particular country that can make it on its own. I think that was with direct reference to President Donald Trump's stance on America first and everyone else later.
No country should prosper
Exactly.
at the expense of others.
Absolutely. And I think that that's a very important point. And you already know how he feels about President Trump. He said a few weeks ago, he let everyone know about that. So I think that I potentially would have expected a little bit more time to have been spent on trying to say, hey, South Africa is fixing things. Come and see what we're doing. Come and invest in the country. We're fixing the challenges that you think we have.
Perhaps he resisted the temptation given, what the theme is for this session, if I may quote, making the United Nations relevant to all people, global leadership and shared responsibilities for peaceful, equitable, and sustainable society. So there probably was a deliberateness about staying with continental, and global politics.
Yes, possibly that's the case, and I think that what's important, in my view, it's not necessarily a bad thing that he took the global picture in his address, because I think it's important for the world as well to see that he's a global thinker. As an African leader, he sees global issues in a certain perspective. And importantly, he did dwell on African issues as well that are very important. And he says Africa is the next frontier in the world in terms of growth. And I do hope that for Africa's sake, presidents and leaders can get together and start to aggressively push the African agenda. So we start to have our own agenda, because everyone else has an agenda for us except for Africa. And I hope he can be a means to facilitate that kind of dialogue.
Gentlemen, thanks to both of you. Unfortunately, that's where we're going to leave it for this evening. After this, Checkpoint looks at the seriousness of strokes. How do you survive it, and what keeps it what does it take to keep going? Checkpoint goes in depth into that issue. That's all from me for tonight. Till we meet again next week at 8 o'clock. Have a good night.